Thank you, Christoph, I think, for that unbelievably embarrassing introduction. Where did you get all that? That's terrifying. You mean you could just go online and find out all that about me, just like that? Anyway, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be speaking to the European Society for Environmental History and the Rachel Carson Center. I've been here for a couple of days and have learned what the center is about and what this organization is about, and it's pretty exciting, the kinds of things that you're doing, and I'm very, very happy to be here, so thank you for that. I'm going to start with a lot of information that just came out in the last week or so, and when I was leaving to come to this meeting on the 19th of August, I checked my email and was very flattered to see that Syngenta, the agribusiness company, had sent me a personal invitation to a meeting in Washington, D.C. To discuss the question of how we can grow enough food in the next millennium, next 50 years, without destroying our planet. And I thought that was a very good place to start this conversation. I'm not going to be able to go to this meeting, but I'm willing to bet that Syngenta has some very interesting ideas about how to do this. Maybe not the same kind of ideas that have been discussed at this meeting, but certainly ones that will be very good for Syngenta in the future. I come at this kind of question and these kinds of email messages from the perspective of food systems. I think of myself as a food systems thinker, that is agriculture, food, nutrition, and public health, the interconnection between them. I'm interested in the whole spectrum from production to consumption, although I mostly focus on the consumption side of this particular equation. When I started out in nutrition, I didn't understand about agriculture at all. I thought agriculture didn't have anything to do with what people ate, and that it was just a matter of personal choice. And now I think you can't understand anything about how the world eats without understanding how the food system works. So that's the perspective, and most of my work over the last 10 or 15 years has been about that. I'm a public health person, and so I look at global public health issues, and they happen to be food system issues, every one of them. The biggest public health nutrition problems in the world today are not enough food, that is, food insecurity is what it's called, and too much food, or obesity. The causes of both food insecurity and obesity are very important to work on, and there's a big dichotomy between personal causes, is what you eat just a matter of personal choice, or does society have something to do with it? And then, of course, I'm really interested in the consequences of the food system for health, the environment, and our planet, and in that way, all of that is very much connected to the issues that are discussed at this conference. Let me say just a few things about food insecurity as an example of the agriculture, food, nutrition, and public health connection. The Food and Agriculture Organization last year said that there were 868 million malnourished people in the world, almost a billion, but actually down from a few years before. Most of them are in Asia and Africa. And obviously they're very concerned about it. As for the causes of malnutrition, I like to go back to the UNICEF framework for the causes that came out in 1990, and this is a framework that seems to me to be very neglected, and it ought to be brought right up to the front, because it's right in the middle of the circulating natures that are discussed here. The immediate causes of malnutrition and death are not having enough food or being diseased, and these are personal causes, something that affects individuals and are called in this framework immediate causes of malnutrition. But the underlying causes and the basic causes of malnutrition are very much societal. They have to do with political resources, with the economic structure, with ideological, what they call the ideological superstructure, and with such things as insufficient health services and an unhealthy environment, social causes. So that if you want to do something about malnutrition, it isn't enough just to feed individuals, you must also change society. And so some of the ways in which food systems approaches to dealing with world hunger are to promote breastfeeding, to make sure people have clean water and safe food, to empower women, to educate the public, to promote sustainable agriculture. You have to have stable political systems. And then the biggest one of all is income equity. These are, except for clean water, which is a technical problem, or can be a technical problem, all of these are social problems. And they require changing society in order to do something about them. Changing society, of course, gets us into politics right away. I emphasize income equity because income inequity underlies both malnutrition and obesity, and they are connected in that way. Poverty underlies both of them. In the United States, for example, the highest levels of food insecurity, and 21% of the American population is considered to be food insecure. The highest rates of food insecurity and the highest rates of obesity are seen in the same social groups, those with lowest income and those with the least amount of education. In the United States, 10% of children are growing up in food insecure households, and 1% of children in the United States are so food insecure that they're at risk of malnutrition. Income inequity underlies obesity, and we've seen in the United States a very rapid rise in levels of obesity. I've put an arrow in front of 1980 because everything that I'm going to be talking about started in 1980, so pay attention to that year. About 30% of the United States population is now considered obese. And it's been leveling off, but it's leveled off at about 30%. And 60% of the population or more are considered overweight and obese, with much higher rates among the poor. But we're not alone in this. About 1.4 billion people are considered to be obese worldwide, with the same starting point in 1980. And these are OECD countries, and the rates are going up absolutely everywhere. And the reason for that, very simple. What this cartoon in USA Today referred to as weapons of mass expansion. So in looking at the obesity problem, which is what I want to turn to now, we want to look at what has happened over the years. What's clear is that dietary risks for disease have become the #1 problem in the United States. For the first time, this is from the Journal of the American Medical Association a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, dietary risks have exceeded tobacco smoking as major risk factor for chronic disease. So obesity is a big problem. It's not just a big problem because of the numbers. There's an enormous expense that's connected with it. The estimated cost in the United States is $150 to $190 billion a year. I have no idea whether those figures are accurate or not, and they're too big to understand anyway. But that's considered to be the estimated cost of health care and lost productivity. And half of that amount ends up being paid for by taxpayers. with obesity not just being a cosmetic problem, but being the major risk factor for chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, which is increasing in proportion to the levels of obesity in the population. So it's a huge, huge problem. Now, the solution to the obesity problem is very simple. It's to eat less, eat better, and to move more. And please don't eat my book. If it seems more complicated than that, it's surely because of the eat less and eat better advice on the food industry. And this was shown beautifully in 2007 when an executive of Coca-Cola gave an interview to the magazine Advertising Age, in which he talked about obesity as the Achilles heel of the food industry. It used to be something they didn't have to pay any attention to. They could just blame obesity on personal responsibility. And now there's so much pressure on food companies, especially soda companies, that it works against their marketing, and they consider it a huge, huge issue. Now, that was in 2007, and I was amazed to read Coca-Cola's annual filing in December to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. All corporations in the United States must produce these annual reports to the SEC, and they are obliged by law to list the risk factors that might influence their business. And the number one risk factor in 2012 is obesity and the pressure on soda companies to back off of sugary drinks. But what fascinated me about this was not only that, but that the number two was water scarcity and poor quality, another place in which obesity, which I worry about, and the kinds of things that you worry about come together. And I'll come back to the water scarcity issue later. But here's obesity identified as the number one risk factor for food companies. And I want to talk a little bit about how we got to that point. So let's go back to the early 1980s when rates of obesity in the United States started to rise. And they must have risen because obesity is a matter of calories in and calories out. This happened either because people were eating more, moving less, or doing both. Well, let's deal with the moving less part first. I don't want to make too big a deal about this because the data are not very good. But the data that we have in the United States do not show very much difference in rates of physical activity or in reported physical activity from 1980 to the present. If anything, activity seems to have increased a little bit among the population, and inactivity seems to have decreased a little bit. But let's not push that. Let's just say there's not much evidence for change in physical activity. On the other hand, there's an enormous amount of evidence for that people are eating more. There, the evidence is absolutely certain. And here's just one line of evidence. There's several lines of evidence. Here's just one. And these are the number of calories available in the United States food supply from 1910 to the year 2000. Up until 1980, the average number of calories available on a per capita basis, that is, every man, woman, and little tiny baby in the country, was about 3,200 calories a day per person. By the year 2000, it had gone up to 3,900 calories a day, an increase of 700 calories. Now, that's not what people are actually eating. People aren't eating 700 calories more because this is food that's available, less exports plus imports. But even if a lot of it is wasted, as the Department of Agriculture insists, it's more calories than are needed by the population, and that makes the food industry extremely competitive. So the food industry gets competitive because it's got to compete for people can only eat so much, even if they're overeating. So that was one consequence, and we have to ask, what was the cause of people eating more beginning in 1980? And I think the answer to that is a deregulatory environment. And I'm going to talk about three kinds of deregulation. The first was agriculture, connecting agriculture to public health. In the late 1970s, agricultural policy changed in the United States from paying farmers not to grow food to paying farmers to grow as much food as they possibly could. And our farmers were very good at reacting to those incentives, and the result of that was mountains of corn in a sea of farm subsidies. But that wasn't all. A second kind of deregulation occurred in 1981, and that was when the shareholder value movement got started, which was a movement of investors in corporations in the United States to get rid of what used to be called blue chip stocks, which were stocks that gave long, slow return on investment. And instead, the movement said, we as investors want higher returns and we want them right away. And the results of that can be seen in the mess on Wall Street today. But it was particularly difficult for food companies because food companies were already trying to sell food in a very competitive environment. Now, they not only had to produce a profit, but they had to produce higher immediate returns on investment and report those higher returns every 90 days to Wall Street, 4 times a year. And the result of it was that food companies had to sell even more to grow. And that forced food companies to find new ways to market their products. It wasn't that food industry executives were sitting around a conference table saying, how are we going to make Americans fat? That's not what they were doing. They were saying, how are we going to sell our products in this enormously competitive environment? And they were quite clever about the ways they found to do it. One way was that they got to market more, because a third kind of deregulation that occurred in the early 1980s was the deregulation of food marketing, especially to children. And that enabled companies to market foods in a way that they had never been able to before. Wrong way. And today we have a situation where the total amount of food and beverage advertising in the United States was $17 billion last year. Most of that spent for foods that aren't particularly healthy. It's very difficult to get figures on advertising expenditures for specific products, but Advertising Age has a few of them every year, and so here are a few examples. Kellogg's company spent $33 million just to advertise Pop-Tarts just in the United States last year. PepsiCo spent $101 million to advertise Gatorade and $82 million to advertise Reese's peanut butter cups. That's just in the United States. I was interested to see these advertisements for Coca-Cola in the Marion subway station, and it reminded me that Coca-Cola spent $243 million last year just in the United States, just to advertise Coca-Cola, that particular brand of Coca-Cola. And we don't have those cute bottles with the names on them in the States. I think they're very adorable. A second way that companies were able to market their products was with health claims. There was a deregulation of health claims to a considerable extent, and here's a product that has 3 different kinds of nutrients on it. And companies want nutrients, want to be able to add nutrients to their food, not because it makes people healthier, because it doesn't, but because it's a really great way to market products. And there's now a substantial amount of research that shows that any kind of health claim on a product helps it sell. So for example, if you have an organic label on a product, or something that says it's fat-free, or something that says it has a vitamin in it, or prevents a disease, that people think it doesn't have any calories. And so it's a great way to market foods. Now, the best way that the companies found to market foods was to make larger portions. And on the bottom part of this graph, with the arrow pointing to 1980, that magic year, you can see that starting in 1980, companies began to introduce larger and larger size portions into the food supply, exactly in parallel with the rising number of calories per person per day in the food supply and with the percent of overweight in the population. Calories count. And here's my former doctoral student who actually did the research that showed this, Lisa Young. And she likes to give talks with these cups out in front of her, and the white cup on the left is an 8-ounce soda cup. You can't even get one that small anymore. But if it doesn't have too much ice in it, it holds 100 calories. The double gulp on the right holds 64 ounces, that's 2 liters, and it has, if it doesn't have too much ice in it, it's 800 calories. If I had one thing that I could teach the American public, or the world for that matter, it would be that larger portions have more calories. It turns out it's not something that's intuitively obvious, and it really requires conscious thinking to realize that. The last way in which food marketers were able to promote more sales was by keeping the cost of food very cheap. And I went to the McDonald's, somewhere around here a couple of days ago, and you can buy 5 €1 hamburgers for €5. If you've got €5, you can go into McDonald's and buy 5 hamburgers. Or if you want one salad, you can get a dinner salad for €6.49. And I find that completely fascinating, that a dinner-sized salad would cost more than 5 hamburgers. And you have to ask why that is. That has to do with agricultural policies. And in the United States, where the proportions are quite similar, it has to do with a lot of tax policies as well. And in the United States, poor people complain bitterly that the cost of fruits and vegetables is too high for them to buy. And it turns out they're right about that. Because if you look at the indexed price of fruits and vegetables as compared to processed foods from that magic year of 1980 to the present, it turns out that the indexed price of fruits and vegetables has gone up by 40%, whereas the index price of beer, butter, and sodas has gone down by 15 to 30%. So it's cheaper, if you're hungry, it's cheaper to buy junk food than it is to buy fruits and vegetables. That's a policy issue. So all in all, it looks like the food industry and the government are collaborating in encouraging people to eat more than they need or should eat. And in this kind of food environment, eating less and eating better is really a challenge. It just doesn't stand a chance. And so what you have to do if you want people to be able to eat better is to change the environment. And environment in this sense has 2 meanings. One is to change this kind of food environment in which people make individual choices, as well as to change the environment that produces the food to begin with. So let's talk about changing the environment. The way to do that is not by asking the food industry to voluntarily regulate itself, because even if the food industry wanted to voluntarily regulate itself, it couldn't, because its investors insist that it grow, and it cannot take actions that do not allow it to grow. And there's now increasing evidence that regulations do indeed change eating behavior and make it easier for people to make more healthful choices. The American Heart Association published a paper last year in which it talked about the various kinds of regulations that could encourage more healthful eating, and these encompass a very wide variety of actions actions, putting calories on menu labels, media education campaigns, color-coded food labels, like Great Britain is doing, restricting fast foods and sodas in various locations, especially where children are, putting restrictions on marketing to kids, curbing the amount of television time that kids watch, making sure that portion sizes don't get too big, banning trans fats, that one's just for heart disease, not obesity, and eliminating toys with kids' meals, taxing and subsidizing healthier foods. When you start thinking about what it's like to try to implement some of these kinds of regulatory approaches, they're just like what I learned today the Munich environmental people had to do in order to get the river restored. It all sounded very familiar to me. Politics is really involved in that. Now, the easiest way to talk about regulation is to talk about soft drinks. And the reason for, and there's now an enormous amount of published scientific evidence that soft drinks are bad for health, that regular consumption of soft drinks is correlated very strongly with poor diets, obesity, and generally poor health. And part of that has to do with the fact that soft drinks are liquid candy. There's sugars and water and not much else, as the advocacy group Center for Science in the Public Interest did in its report a few years ago. And soft drinks are also deliberately marketed to the low-income and minority groups that are most at risk for obesity. So there are lots of reasons for being concerned about soft drinks. I live in New York City, which has a very activist mayor and a health commissioner, and over the last several years, the city has engaged in several campaigns aimed at reducing obesity and its consequences, particularly type 2 diabetes. And these were subway campaigns that had signs up in the various subways. Your kid just ate 26 packs of sugar in that soda. You have to walk the 3 miles from Union Square to Brooklyn to burn off the calories in 1 20-ounce sodas, and an effort to reduce portion sizes, showing that if you're going to be drinking great big sodas, you're going to get diabetes and have to have your foot amputated. The most radical of these, or what turned out to be the most radical of these approaches, was Mayor Bloomberg's attempt to restrict the size of sodas that could be sold within city limits. And the restriction was at a 16-ounce size. Anything over than that could not be sold in the city. You could buy as many 16-ounce sodas as you wanted, but you couldn't get anything bigger than that. The opposition to that was ferocious. I can't think of any other word for it. The soda industry pulled out all possible stops. There were signs on delivery trucks, there were home mailings saying, "Don't let bureaucrats tell you what size beverage to buy," as if this was an infringement of personal freedom. The companies used social media, radio and TV ads. There were airplane banners, there were petitions. The picture shows somebody who was one of the people who was collecting petitions. They were paid $30 an hour, which is pretty good wages for collecting signatures. There were T-shirts and all of those kinds of things. The matter is still in court, but the soda companies took the mayor to court, and so far the soda companies are winning. We'll have to see what happens. But if you're going to do any of these regulatory approaches, and if the industry thinks that the regulation might actually reduce sales, you will be up against a great deal of opposition. And this was the kind of thing that induced a colleague who's a pediatrician and I to write an editorial for the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years ago, asking the rhetorical question, can the food industry play a constructive role in the obesity epidemic? Obviously, we were dubious, because the goals of industry to make a profit and the goals of public health to make people healthy are not necessarily congruent. The soda industry is particularly upset about what's happening because sales of sodas are down in the United States. They're either flat or declining, and they have been for several years now, whereas sales have increased practically everywhere else in the world, and that is because the soda industry has moved its marketing overseas. So, as have actually every major processed food company has moved its marketing overseas. So Kraft profits climb on sales in emerging markets. PepsiCo doubles its profits on overseas beverages. Coca-Cola is pumping billions into India to market its products to India, and they're in China and Myanmar and Africa and every other developing country that you can possibly think of. That's where the sales are, and the expectation is that rates of obesity will go up. At least public health expectations are that rates of obesity will go up concurrently. Executives of PepsiCo and some of the people that they work with have published articles in professional journals talking about how the soda industry can help the growing global burden of malnutrition and can improve child health in sub-Saharan Africa. Each of these articles, every time one of these articles appears, and there are lots of them, public health people usually write rebuttals saying this is an absolutely ridiculous. The soda industry is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And some of all of that comes about from where we are on dietary advice. If you ask nutritionists like me what people ought to be eating, I would say you eat food. You don't eat products. You, as the United States government says, you make half your plate fruits and vegetables. This, however, is not how the agricultural policy works in a lot of countries. I taught a course a couple of years ago on the Farm Bill. I teach at New York University, and I get to teach whatever I want, and I decided it was time to learn about the Farm Bill, which is the big agricultural policy bill that's currently stuck in Congress. And I asked my class on the first day what an ideal agricultural policy would look like. And this is what they told me, that an ideal agricultural policy would make farmers have a decent living. It would provide adequate, affordable food for everybody in the country. It would promote local, regional, organic, and sustainable food systems, fruits and vegetables. It would promote fair trade. It would protect natural resources and animal welfare. It would prevent deforestation, climate change, pollution, and unnecessary waste, all of the issues that have been core to this particular conference. But that's not what we're doing. Our agricultural policy in the United States provides direct payments for commodity crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, rice, peanuts, and so forth, and zero support except for token pilot programs for fruits and vegetables. So we have an agricultural policy that's directly in conflict with public health goals. And if we look at the agricultural policy, it's promoting industrial agriculture and therefore all of the effects anticipated and unanticipated of industrial agriculture on health, on farm workers, on animals, on rural communities, on the environment, and on the climate. And there have been any number of reports that have talked about what these kinds of things are like in the United States, and I think a lot of it is analogous to everywhere else. Usually when people talk about climate change, they talk about the effect of climate change on crop productivity. And this was published in Science magazine a couple of weeks ago. The red colors on this particular map are expectations that by 2050 agricultural productivity will decline. The green agricultural productivity will increase. And you can see from this that productivity is expected to decline in the areas of the world that need it the most. But what I find interesting is that hardly anyone ever talks about the effect of agriculture on climate change. The estimates of the effect of agriculture on climate change range from 5% to 25%. This particular graph is somewhere in the middle at 15%. I don't know how accurate that is. It's a ballpark figure. But one thing is very clear, and that is most of the contribution to climate change from agriculture comes from animal production and industrial animal production. And this, of course, raises many concerns because everyone expects that as emerging economies emerge, there will be increasing demands for meat. This particular slide, or this particular graph, comes from not radical environmentalists. It comes from J.P. Morgan, a global equity banking and research firm, which published this quite amazing report in 2008, in which they talked about the global average water requirement in liters per kilogram of beef, pork, and chicken. For every kilogram of beef, it takes 15,000 liters of water in producing the crops that feed the animal, and in all of the other ways in which water comes into it. So if people are eating more meat, that's going to be producing a big effect on water. Agriculture already is responsible for 70% of water use, or at least of what they call blue water use, which is the kind that's flowing, and it's expected, all of this is expected to increase. And in relating, because this is production, I'm interested in consumption, let's go back to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this time look at number two. The number two risk, which is the Coca-Cola Company, is very worried about water supplies, water scarcity and the poor quality of water, and that is because Coca-Cola says it uses about 300 billion liters of water a year to produce Coca-Cola for the world. J.P. Morgan research analysts are very dubious about this figure. They think the 300 billion liter figure is greatly underestimated, and they talk in their report about why they think it's underestimated. But one of the things that they're particularly concerned about is that the Coca-Cola Company considers water use to be a global problem, when in fact water use is a local problem. And that's shown by this map from the Food and Agriculture Organization, which shows the areas of the world that are fast approaching physical water scarcity. And you can see they're in that sort of orangey yellow band. And the World Economic Forum, again, these are not raging environmentalists, these are business analysts, are worried about the water, food, energy, climate nexus because of the risk to global food. And they see the water problem as leading to a global food crisis. And that brings us back to income inequality. The Washington Post a couple of weeks ago had this map of income inequality, Gini coefficients, for those of you who know about those things. And this is a difficult map to look at, but the red, orange, pink, and purple colors are places that have high income inequality. I live in one of those places. And the green, blue, and the darker sort of bluishy colors are places that have more income equality, and some of those places are places that have other problems, or because the income, they may have equal income, but the income is too low for them to do anything. So all of these things, I guess my point is that all of these things are very closely interrelated, and it seems to me it leaves us with two questions. The first question is, how do we move from a world in which there are 1 billion hungry people to one in which people have enough food without going through an intermediate problem of making people obese and sick that way? And I don't think anybody has the answer to that question yet. because most governments can't regulate enough to do anything about it. The second question was asked by The Lancet this month in this article on the politics of reducing malnutrition. The Lancet asked, how can we ensure that agriculture, social protection, and water and sanitation systems and programs support nutrition goals? And I thought that was a beautiful way of just tying all of these different threads together and showing that all of these things are closely related. The challenge for food system advocates, and I consider myself one, and I think you are too, is to link agricultural, health development, and environmental policies in a way that they mutually support each other. And these are several reports that attempt to do that kind of thing. The one thing that makes it easier to think about that is that the healthy diets are the ones that are least damaging to the environment. So a healthy food pyramid has fruits and vegetables at the bottom. That means you're supposed to eat more of them. The environmental pyramid, the least damage is caused by growing fruits and vegetables and vice versa. So if we were aiming to get people throughout the world to eat more healthfully, that would be really good for the environment at the same time. And that gives a place for public health, nutrition, and environmental people to come together in coalitions to try to gain some real political power and make change. In the United States, we're very interested in how to generate political power around these kinds of issues. And the New York Times a few years ago asked, is a food revolution now in season? If the New York Times thinks there's a food revolution, there's a food revolution. Otherwise, they wouldn't be writing about it. And the food movement in the United States is unusual for people who study social movements. It's very dispersed and very diversified, and there are lots and lots of people working on lots of different kinds of issues. There's this, but all of them in revolutionary terms: the organic revolution, the food revolution, the slow food revolution. We even had Occupy the food system last year, support local agriculture, animal welfare. And the objective now is to try to bring all of these disparate groups together to join in coalitions in order to try to gain real political power. So at the personal level, as an individual, if you're not interested in trying to gain political power, just for individuals, you try to focus on food, not products. You encourage people to eat smaller portions. You promote local and sustainable agriculture. You grow your own food. Cook at home and teach kids to cook. The most radical thing that anybody can do about food is to teach kids to cook. But on the political level, I think we have to advocate social responsibility for a lot of these issues. And these range from agriculture to public health. On the agriculture side, worrying about sustainability and food safety, which I haven't talked about, but it's very closely involved with all of these things. Promotion of fruits and vegetables and protecting the environment, and sustainability being part of that. On the public health side, making sure that schools are safe places for kids to eat, that people have access to food in their neighborhood, that there's a decent safety net for people who don't have any money. Doing something about marketing to kids, which crosses ethical lines. And in the United States, because our campaign laws are the source of corruption in American politics, trying to change those, and then holding corporations accountable for their marketing, lobbying, and other kinds of practices. These are the kinds of things I discuss in my next book, which is coming out in a couple of weeks. It's called Eat, Drink, Vote, An Illustrated Guide to Food Politics, and it's a cartoon book. It has 250 political cartoons in it, and this is the last one in the book. And if you can't read the caption, it says, "Vote with your fork." Even better, vote with your vote. Thank you very much.